Kapow, kabang, welcome back. Welcome to this evening's episode of Live with Littlewood with me, Mark Littlewood, the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Good evening to you if you're watching from London or the UK. Good morning to you if you're watching from California or the West Coast of America. And happy Thursday to you if you're watching from down under. We've got 100 minutes or so with a great lineup of guests to put the world to rights. And let me run through what we're going to be discussing on tonight's show. The state of the economy. If the latest economic numbers are to be believed, the UK economy has shrunk back to the size it was way back in 2002. Are we going back to the future? How the hell do we get out of this economic tailspin? It doesn't look like much of a V-shaped recovery just at the moment. Then we'll be asking sort of who runs Britain, really? Who regulates the regulators? Vast waves of regulations have come in during the coronavirus lockdown, but who's in charge of them? Is the administrative state getting out of control? And we'll be touching at the end of the programme, but throughout our discussion, on the face mask issue. Should it be compulsory on pain of a £100 fine to wear a face covering when you visit a shop? What is the definition of a shop? What is the definition of a face covering? Is this just sort of security theatre, or is it meaningful? Before I introduce my first guests, let me tell you who's going to be coming up later on the show. We've got a great lineup of commentators, journalists, think tankers, economists. Later on, we'll be joined by Madeline Grant. She's back on the programme, the assistant comment editor at the Telegraph, formerly one of the team here at the IEA. Towards the end of the show, to talk us through some of the science around public health and face masks, we'll be joined by Tom Whipple, the science editor at the Times, but more importantly, my first cousin as well. We'll also be joined later in the show by our very own Syed Kamall, the academic and research director here at the IEA, and previously a member of the European Parliament, so I'm sure he'll be able to weigh in on his understanding of regulation. It's a super duper double Telegraph episode tonight because we're also joined by dear Chakravarty, Brexit editor at the Telegraph, formerly, of course, at the Taxpayers Alliance. It's a warm welcome back to the programme to both Sam Bowman, the Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics and Senior Fellow at the Adam Smith Institute, and we'll be joined by our very own Victoria Hewson, Head of Regulatory Affairs and author of our new report from the IEA on regulators. That's a little bit later, but let me introduce my first guests. Joined by Douglas Carswell, former Member of Parliament, author, good friend of the IEA, public intellectual, head of the Good Governance Project. Douglas, great to have you back. A very good evening to you.
Good evening, Mark. It's good to be here.
We're also rejoined by Toby Young, associate editor of both The Spectator and Quillette, as well as being founder and general secretary of the Free Speech Union. Evening, Toby.
Evening, Mark.
And Julian Jessop, independent economist, now independent of the IEA, formerly the chief economist at the IEA and a senior fellow here at the IEA and a prolific writer and commentator on all things economic. Good evening, Julian.
Good evening, Mark.
So I want to start, guys, with what sort of lockdown has meant, what damages it's caused. And Douglas, perhaps I can start with you. We know that Boris Johnson unsurprisingly said today there's going to be some form of independent inquiry into the coronavirus pandemic and how it's been handled. We don't yet know whether it will be a public inquiry or some select committee or something like that. But if we were to look at the economy, the economic consequences of the lockdown that we've been through, they look pretty severe indeed. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical about trying to measure everything to each last decimal point per quarter. These numbers often get hugely rounded up or hugely rounded down. But I was rather taken by a graph showing the UK economy's changes in GDP on a 3-month rolling average since the turn of the millennium. And it sort of bobbles along. You can see where 2008 is. There's a bit of a dip there. but it falls off the edge of a cliff in the last 3 months. What do you make of this, Douglas? Do you think we should be a bit sceptical about these numbers? Are they broadly what you're expecting? And is any hope of a quick bounce back now slipped through our fingers?
I think it's pretty grim. Output is down by about a fifth since the government officially mandated that people should be economically inactive. And we now see from the latest data out today that far from being the so-called V-shaped recovery with a quick upswing, actually we've fallen off a cliff and we look as if we're lounging around on the valley floor. To put it this way, our output has fallen so much that Britain today has a per capita output equivalent to the pre-crisis levels of Puerto Rico or Spain or Malta. Now, if you're not feeling that much poorer, it's because it's happened very rapidly and very dramatically. But if we don't do something about it and do something about it pretty quickly, we are going to be we're not going to be a rich first world country the way we think of ourselves. It really is that group, and the time to get this right and fix this problem is now. It can't wait any longer. There are some pretty fundamental mistakes in the way the government has handled this economically. Our bovine commentariat is still singing the praises of the government's handling because they liked some speech or other that was given. But the fundamental response to this in economic terms is bad, and we need to change, and we need to change pretty quickly.
Douglas, I'll come back to you in a moment for what those radical prescriptions should be. But before I come to you, Toby, you've been a long-standing lockdown skeptic for freedom reasons, apart from just economic reasons. But Julian, what's your take on these numbers? Is this what you were expecting? Is this on the worse end? Are we in for a, not so much a roller coaster, just a downward path? I mean, this looks pretty bad. Do you agree with Douglas on that?
Well, I'm a bit more optimistic than Douglas, though frankly that doesn't sound too difficult to do. A couple of points. I mean, first of all, the sharp fall in GDP that we've seen in economic activity, in a sense, is exactly what the government wanted to achieve. This is an unprecedented recession, but it's also unique. It's one that the government was actually trying to stop people from doing what they would normally do, including going to work and going to school and spending as much in the shops as they would otherwise have done. So it's been a recession that is a result of government policy for good or ill. Also, the government has done an enormous amount to protect businesses and jobs and basic incomes during that period. So for most people, it's not actually felt like a 25% fall in economic activity. To a large degree, they've been protected. The bad news, of course, is that this can't go on forever. The lockdown does have to be lifted. The government does have a magic monetary where it continue to pay people to sit around and do nothing forever. That hadn't started to happen in May. The figures there were disappointing. But remember that the lockdown was still largely in place there. And I think the figures for June and July onwards will be a lot better. And there's already plenty of evidence actually from the retail sector that things are improving. But in order for us to get some sort of V-shaped recovery over the rest of the year, you do have to have a continued easing of the lockdown. And just as importantly, consumers and also businesses have to feel more confident to spend again. And in the case of businesses, to hire again or to retain workers that might otherwise be let go. So there's still a lot needs to be done in terms of easing the lockdown and maintaining confidence. But I don't think we should be too surprised at the extent of the decline in economic activity so far. And if you believe that the lockdown was worth it, then if anything, you'd argue that was what you wanted to see in the first place.
It was a deliberate diminution of economic activity. Obviously, that was part of the policy. Toby, you right from the outset were a lockdown skeptic. You thought that the science behind it was pretty poor. What do you make of the economic damage, but also the damage to civil liberties that's been a result of this? And, should we be optimistic that we're now emerging from it, or we seem to get new regulations coming in, on a regular basis, not just the easing of them, most obviously the face mask rule, which has just been brought in. What's your take on it, Toby?
Yeah, well, I think, as pessimistic as Douglas about the impact of the lockdown, but even more pessimistic than him about what we can do to mitigate that impact and fire up the engines of the economy. And the government doesn't seem to be thinking very clearly or sending out any clear messages about how to fire up those engines. And as you say, the announcement yesterday that face masks are going to be mandatory in shops from July 24th isn't the right way to fire up the retail sector. It's unpleasant enough shopping as it is, what with the need to queue outside shops, being forced to use hand sanitizer when you go in. If they're going to add being forced to wear face masks as well when shopping, that's going to mean fewer people go shopping, more people stay at home and shop online. That's going to devastate the high street. So it doesn't seem as though the government has a clear, well thought out strategy for how to restart the economy. I think the case against the lockdown was in part an economic case, that the economic damage will be catastrophic. And of course, those of us who were sounding that alarm bell, I think, have been proved completely right. Of course, there's all the cost of the impact on the British economy is constantly being ratcheted up and up. As you say, it doesn't look like it's going to be a V-shaped economic recovery. It looks more like an I. But globally, the impact of the lockdowns, let's not forget that more than a quarter of the world's population has been locked down at some point this year. And the global impact of that was recently assessed by a group of international academics, published a peer-reviewed paper on it a few weeks ago, and they estimated that the global cost to the economy was $3.8 trillion, and the job losses number in 147 million. But that was only part of the case against the lockdown. The main thrust of the case, I think, is that if you're going to remove people's liberties, you need to be able to make a persuasive argument that there is a tangible public health benefit. And I don't think the government ever persuaded us, ever made a persuasive case that there is a tangible public health benefit from locking down. Professor Carl Hennigan at the Oxford Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine, he believes, and he's produced some data to show this, and he's not the only one, that actually the reproduction number fell to below 1 in the week leading up to lockdown. If you recall, the government announced various more modest social distancing measures on March 16th, such as the voluntary quarantining of people who thought they had the disease and their households, keeping 2 meters distance from one another, washing our hands frequently, and so forth. And it was the lockdown, the full lockdown, was introduced a week later without giving the government or its scientific advisors time to assess just how effective those measures were. But it now looks as though those measures were effective, and that going further than that and imposing a full lockdown wasn't necessary. And one piece of evidence to that effect is that if you look at the number of deaths, which is quite a good way of measuring how many people were actually infected and when infections peaked. Deaths peaked on April the 8th. And there's about a 3-week lag period between infection and death for those who do die after they become infected, which is, of course, a tiny percentage. So if you go back 3 weeks from April the 8th, that takes you to slap bang in the middle of the week, March 16th to March 23rd. So it looked
which was when it was voluntary. Yeah.
And other indicators that the voluntary activity prior to the imposition of the full lockdown were effective are things like travel data. If you look at how many people were using public transport in that week, it declined by something like 80% before the lockdown was imposed. So it looks as though the lockdown itself wasn't necessary to bring about the fall in the R number and to mitigate the impact of the virus. And of course, we can see other countries around the world that didn't lock down, such as Sweden and Belarus. The rise and fall of infections, the number of deaths per million in those countries.
Similarly, though, right? If the lockdown had been voluntary, there still would have been a hit to the economy, right? Even if the government hadn't forced a lockdown, if people were deciding not to go out, not to shop, not to go to work, we still would have had a pretty major fall in GDP, right?
Well, perhaps, but it wouldn't have been anything like as great as it is. If you look at the impact on Sweden's GDP, it hasn't been nearly as great, and it's not forecast to be nearly as great as it is on ours. I mean, a good point of comparison, Mark, is how the British government managed the Asian flu pandemic of 1957 to 1958. Again, voluntary measures were introduced. People were encouraged to engage in modest social distancing measures, such as washing their hands more frequently, quarantining if they felt ill, and so forth. The number of people who died during that epidemic, it was a global pandemic, but in the UK, the number of people who died, I think, was 33,000. If you adjust that upwards for the different size in population, then it comes to about 42,000. So not wildly different from the number of people who have died during this epidemic. And they actually, for the whole of 1958, the economy grew by 1.5%. There was a GDP fell by 2.5% in Q2 in 58, but in every other quarter in 58, it actually grew. So I think it's pretty clear that had we not imposed the full lockdown, the economic impact of the voluntary behaviour wouldn't have been anything like as great.
Douglas, let me come back to you. What I'm interested in is what the prescription is. I mean, we might well have decided that we wouldn't have started from here, that the lockdown was badly imposed or wholly unnecessary. But what do you think, Douglas, that the government needs to do beyond just removing the regulations that have been imposed upon us? What's the package of measures that we need to bounce back?
Clearly, the lockdown sledgehammer missed the COVID nut, but it's tanked the economy. It smashed the economy to smithereens. It's not just the restrictions on liberty, though. I think the government needs to stop doing things that induce economic inertia. I think one of the big problems, and I think one of the big mistakes, is the extended furlough to October. Millions of people are being paid not to work and not to be economically active. And worse than that, many of them are in jobs that are no longer going to exist at the end of this process. If you can unfreeze that so that they can begin to reallocate people to jobs as quickly as possible, the depth of this downturn will be minimized. So wind up the furlough and wind it up pretty quickly. Stop running up massive debts for a Christmas holiday during the summer, extended over a period that no one actually wants to be taking, because that's what the government is doing. They're paying for us to be on, in effect, a long-term vacation. And the bill is going to come in and it's going to be absolutely massive. I fear that the current Chancellor, if he's not careful, will be remembered as the guy who lost control of public finances. Now, we were in that situation in the 70s, and it's a situation you really don't want to be in as a country. I think the third thing the government needs to do is get a grip over public services. There is no reason whatsoever why teachers can't turn up for work on a Monday. That should be the strategy for reopening schools. There is no reason why we should have a health service that isn't now focused on all those other diseases besides COVID. We need to get back to public services that actually deliver. I think there are other things we're going to have to do, though, if we're serious. It's lockdown and compulsion that cause downturn. It's liberty and freedom that are the road to prosperity. So I think the government needs to look at removing a lot of the restrictions that temporarily it's eased and relaxed during lockdown, whether that's allowing people to serve pizza on a pavement or scrapping some of the stringent rules on clinical trials and clinical testing. We need, I think, a wholesale liberalization of the economy. I think we need drastic tax cuts. The government is talking about trying to balance the books by introducing new taxes. I think that would be a really bad thing to do. I think now is the time for us to really reassess the economic model we have. We need lower regulation and lower taxes if we're going to get through this. Simply assuming that we can go back to the world as we thought it was in February this year, it's going to be, if we try that, we're going to be like Japan. We're going to have 20 years of sluggish growth, high debt, and mass unhappiness, particularly amongst young people. It won't be pretty.
But let me press you a little bit on this, Douglas, because I must admit I'm a bit betwixt and between on this one. Both you and I are obviously enthusiasts for a much lower tax burden. But I'm trying to offset that against my fiscal hawkishness, if you like. I mean, I don't want the government to run up a colossal deficit and add to the national debt and the burden of future generations. Unfortunately, I think it's already done too much of that. It's added to that. I don't want taxes to go up, but I want the deficit to go down. So I'm going to my sort of safe haven of deregulation. That's stuff that requires political capital, but can be done for virtually no cost. You could liberalise planning laws. You go, small example of selling pizza on a pavement, but you could enormously liberalise the rules about the uses of buildings, rather than having a whole process of reallocating it. That's the cheap way. But are you being a bit of a fiscal dove? Do you think we should take the deficit on the chin and still, I don't know, abolish employers' NICs, reduce corporation tax, cut the basic rate of income tax, a whole package of things that one would want to do, if you like, in peacetime, or if one could? Is that now just unaffordable? Are we going to have to bite the bullet on taxes staying high because the government spending side has been incontinent?
I think when Rishi Sunak announced that extraordinarily generous offer, generous with future generations of taxpayer money, that was the moment where the idea that we could balance the books for the next decade or two, I'm afraid, needs to be put to one side. We're going to have a huge amount of debt, equivalent to a war bond. I'm afraid that is the scale of this disaster. I think it's completely unnecessary for all sorts of reasons, but we are where we now are. We're going to have to treat this as war bonds. The question is, do we raise tax and lower the trajectory of economic growth to pay for it? Or do we take the bonds and reduce taxation in order to maximize that growth trajectory? Growing our way out of this, I'm afraid, I think is the only way forward. That means we're going to have to carry a lot of debt. It is preferable to carry that debt and grow our way out of it than to try foolishly to somehow balance the books and end up balancing the books with 90% rates of taxation. I'm afraid if we do that, we're not going to balance the books and we're not going to grow. The least worst option now is to treat these as war bonds and to finance accordingly. People sometimes say, "Can we afford tax cuts?" I'm not sure that we can afford the old Western model of high welfare anymore. We simply can't. And maybe it takes an event like this to shake us out of our 30-year stupor. We should, I think, in 2007, 2008, have realized that our high borrowing, high spend, high welfare model didn't work. There are now hundreds of millions of Chinese and Indians who are as productive, if not more so than we are, who have a living standard comparable with us, and who make their own provision for things that we look to the government to make for us. That simply can't carry on now. And this, I think, has to be the catalyst for that change.
Julian, let me come to you on all three of you shared some pessimism. Where are you, Julian, on prescription? I think you and I, when we've discussed this, we share a lot in common, a lot of common views, but I'm probably a bit more fiscally hawkish. How worried should we be about the debt mountain? And what's the prescription? What would you do to supercharge the economy that might now be plausible because of the crisis, as Douglas has just highlighted, the sort of things that could be put on the table now that if this pandemic had never happened would have been considered fantasy land? The politically impossible becomes the politically necessary, if you like.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I am relatively relaxed about the increase in borrowing that we've seen so far. I mean, it's sort of extraordinary for somebody who used to work at the IA and used to work at the Treasury to say that. But I think we're going to borrow an additional, say, 300 billion this year that we wouldn't otherwise have done. Half of that, though, is sort of special measures like the job retention scheme that are going to be wound down over the next few months anyway. And the other half is the indirect effect on the public finances of the slump in economic activity, the impact of that on tax revenues and welfare spending, and that should automatically reverse as well. So the public borrowing numbers should come down significantly next year anyway, even if the government doesn't take any further action. In the meantime, the debt levels will be higher, but they're relatively easy to finance at low interest rates at the moment. And over time, the burden of debt, so debt as a share of GDP, is going to come down as well as GDP itself recovers. So I think so far, we can feel reasonably relaxed about what's happened. However, going forward, this shouldn't be seen as the green light for the government to continue to intervene on anywhere near this scale. I mean, I share the concerns that Douglas in particular has about the job retention scheme, the idea that you're going to pay lots of people just to sit around and do nothing, or to subsidize them to go back to jobs that are jobs that are no longer going to be viable in the longer term. I think it's absolutely right for the government to be winding that up. Looking forward, I think that trying to tackle the deficit and the debt numbers by either raising taxes or by massive cuts in public expenditure would be a mistake. I think the solution has to be growth. I know that's an easy thing to say, but there are actually quite a few things that you can do to support growth that don't involve further pain. I mean, for a start, continuing to ease the lockdown. I think it's essential also that the government gets its messaging right. I'll be interested to hear what the real experts have to say later on about the face masks, but it does worry me that seems to be taking, a big step back after a few steps forward. And then on top of that, you've got all the sort of deregulation agenda that we obviously at the IEA firmly support. But I think you have to have sort of a growth-led strategy, a remorseless focus on things that boost growth and allow the private sector to recover from the shock it's had over the last few months, rather than thinking that what we've seen over the last few months should become the new normal, where the government is intervening in everything, spending enormous amounts of money, setting wages and prices and so on and so on. I think that'll be exactly the wrong lesson to take from this crisis. In future, the government needs to be bold, and actually means doing less rather than more.
Julian, before I come back to you, Toby, Julian, let me just ask you though, do you think some of the measures we've taken haven't just sort of shielded people from this collapse in the economy? The furlough scheme, again, clearly designed to do that, right? It was supposed to be a shield against it. But this now additional £1,000 bounty, if you like, for keeping on staff, if you put them on furlough, if they're still in your employ by, I think it's the end of January next year, you get a £1,000 bounty. I mean, I'm sceptical of economic forecasting, but I'm expecting a major tick up in unemployment on the 1st of February 2021, because you'll keep them on to the end of January. So are these moves really just delaying the recession? Right, we don't want it to bite now, so we'll kick the can down the road a bit, but it will bite at least as hard, if not harder then.
Well, it's a difficult balancing act because, there is a risk that nothing changes. All you're doing is kicking the can down the road. But in the meantime, two things are changing. I mean, first of all, you are continuing to ease the lockdown. So hopefully by the time that the job retention scheme is wound down and then finally ended, all of the key sectors of the economy will be open. There may well still be some social distancing constraints upon them, but at least they will be to some extent back to normal. And the other thing, hopefully, that will be going on is that consumers and businesses will have the confidence to spend again. So it's not just about the opportunity to spend; it's also about the sort of willingness to do that. If the government gets those two things right, the easing of the lockdown and restoring confidence, then I think we won't get that sort of tidal wave of job losses that people fear, whether it's in the autumn or at the beginning of next year. But that's a really difficult balancing act. You get a 25% fall in economic activity. There are probably millions of people effectively unemployed at the moment. It's going to be very hard to get it right.
Toby, do you think we're going to be able to, I mean, Julian was sort of saying, 2 steps forward, 1 step back in easing this lockdown. As a lockdown skeptic yourself, do you think that's going to be the way we're going to get out of it? You'll be able to go into a pub or a restaurant, but you'll have to be socially distanced by 1 metre, in a few weeks' time by 50 centimetres or whatever. And then occasionally they might bring in a new regulation. Or do you think this is going to take years to unwind? I mean, can you imagine face masks being compulsory in public when there's the future bout of seasonal flu, for example? I mean, if they're legitimate for COVID-19, might it not just be a standard public health measure in future?
Well, I think the case for face masks, particularly non-surgical face masks in non-healthcare settings, and in particular reusable non-surgical face masks, is so flimsy that you could just as easily make the case that they should be worn to prevent infection during the next bout of seasonal flu. Yes, I hope the government won't make that argument. I mean, I think that the government has succeeded in terrifying the population. Project Fear Mark II, Project Fear on steroids, it's been called, has been devastatingly effective. And I think the government has actually boxed itself into a corner. It has been so successful in getting the public to wildly overestimate the risk posed by COVID-19 in order to try and get them to comply with these draconian measures, these draconian restrictions, without bleating too much about it. They've been so successful that the public is now very reluctant to come out from under their beds. And I think the only possible rationale I can think of for the making face masks mandatory in shops. I mean, we know, I think, that the scientific argument, the scientific case, is feeble at best. All the evidence that suggests face masks are effective, all the evidence that's been compiled, all the evidence that Matthew Lesh, for instance, referred to in his CapEx piece about face masks today, and he's in favour, all the evidence he refers to is evidence that surgical masks, which are disposed after one use, worn outside healthcare settings, are effective at reducing viral transmission. There isn't any evidence at all that non-surgical masks are effective, that wearing bandanas, for instance, that making a mask out of a T-shirt. There's actually a sort of diagram on the government's website today about how to make a mask out of a T-shirt. The evidence that there's just no evidence at all. Matthew's counter-argument is, yes, well, there's no evidence that they don't work either. But actually, I think you need a more robust standard if you're going to defend the removal of one of our civil liberties than merely saying, well, there's no evidence that it doesn't have a public health benefit, so let the government do it. That's ridiculous. But I think that the government has been so successful in paralysing with fear the British public that perhaps the reason they've introduced this, what is essentially a placebo, is to try and reassure the public. So they'll go back out shopping if they believe, quite wrongly, that face masks are going to reduce their risk of infection. I mean, there's almost no risk of infection. The virus has almost completely disappeared. The people trying to develop the vaccine are having a real problem because there are so few people that are actually infectious now. The number of new cases per day is in the region of 500. Well, you remain infectious for about 10 days. So that means at any one time, maybe 5,000 people in the country are infectious. Yeah. And if you assume that 60% of them are symptomatic, that's only about just about 2,000 people who are out and about potentially shopping, 2,000 people out of a population of 67 million. Your chances of contracting COVID by going to Tesco's are probably lower than your chances of dying in a road traffic accident. So, it's like almost you're trying to mitigate a non-existent risk by doing something completely pointless. It's like wearing a tinfoil hat in order to reduce the possibility of you getting struck by lightning. I mean, it's just completely bonkers. But perhaps if people think that they are going to be struck by lightning and that tinfoil hats are going to protect them from that, and you make wearing of tinfoil hats mandatory in shops, perhaps people will be more likely to go out shopping.
Douglas, I want to come back to you because I know you need to leave us in just a few minutes on I'm no scientist, but it's interesting to hear Toby's points and skepticism about some of the science. But Douglas, do you think whatever the sensible remedial health steps could be, that we could have done all of this or much of it without state-mandated action? I mean, if Tesco's want to impose a rule that you have to wear a surgical mask or indeed a hazmat suit, well, that's kind of up to Tesco. They won't be getting my custom. Could we have left it to the private sector to find the right solutions?
Absolutely. There's strong evidence that in terms of reducing the trajectory of the virus, the way forward, there's strong evidence that actually what was needed to prevent the virus. Let me start that again. There's strong evidence to suggest that actually, long before these compulsory measures were introduced on March the 26th, that actually the R rate was falling. What troubles me though is that the habit of control, I think, has now taken root, and it'll be very hard to undo what the government has made compulsory. Can anyone seriously imagine schools, for example, in September, not now making masks compulsory? We're going to see, I think, more and more calls for more restrictions, and I think it's going to become progressively harder for the government to lift these restrictions. Every busybody within any organisation, every job's worth in the country now has what they need to restrict activity and to not give the customer what the customer wants. I think the government's gone about this the wrong way, and I think it's bad for the economy, and I'm not sure it's been a proportionate response at all. People are pretty good at assessing risk if left to their own devices. And I think if people were left, as in Sweden, to avoid crowds, to adapt, if they were told what the risks were and allowed to get on with their lives, but while managing and mitigating the risk, I think we would be in a much better place as a country. I also think we'd be happier. I think we actually feel really miserable when we're patronized by government and by officials. I think the country feels as if it's in this funk, and we'll get out of this funk when we're left to make these judgments for ourselves as adults rather than patronized as school children.
So, guys, all three of you, I know you all need to run. I've got a 1 second question for each of you, which will go to the Live with Littlewood Economic Barometer Optimism Index, which is how optimistic you're feeling about the next 2 or 3 years, the extent to which Britain in 2 or 3 years' time will be a free and prosperous country. Toby, can I have your number out of 10?
3.
3, okay, that's a pretty grim start. Julian?
6.
6, okay, you're getting there. And Douglas?
I'm on 6 too. I'm less optimistic than I was, but I still think that I still think that this country will be a better place in 10 years than it is today.
Okay, so a balanced view. We're not talking ourselves into a complete despair here. Gentlemen, thank you all.
Sorry, Douglas seemed to switch the goalpost there. He said he thinks the country's, he's 60% sure the country will be a better place in 10 years' time. That wasn't the question. You said in 3 years' time.
In 3 years' time.
I'd agree. I'm with him on that. I think if you increase the time horizon, then I go to a 6 too. But if you're talking about the next 3 years, I'm still at a 3.
Okay, well, in the next episode, I might have to introduce a meta index of whether the next 2 years are contributing to the next decade. But in the meantime, Julian, Douglas, Toby, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a pleasure having you. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you very much for your thoughts and your insights. It's been a great pleasure having you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks very much.
Goodbye. Thanks so much. We're now joined by the deadly duo of the Telegraph to give their thoughts on these issues and where the economy is. It's a great pleasure to welcome back onto the programme Madeline Grant, who used to work for us here at the IEA and is now at the Telegraph, and Dia Chakravarty as well at the Telegraph. We're giving the Telegraph a lot of good free advertising here. Hope you remember that, guys, when you're considering what comment columns to commission in the coming days. A great warm welcome to Dia Chakravarty to the show as well. Maddie, hello, good evening.
Hi, Mark, how are you?
Very well, very well. Well, a bit depressed actually after our first 3 guests. So your job, Maddie, is to cheer me up. Dia, you're going to cheer me up as well, aren't you?
Always.
Always, good. So let's. You would have been hearing we've been discussing the sort of state of the economy. Dia, I'm going to start with you. Do you think there is just now a sort of straight trade-off between the immediate health risk, and we can argue whether that is tiny, small, medium, or large, and the economic gain? Should we be just seeing it as a trade-off in this particular fashion that, if we want to get the economy going again, we're going to have to kind of reluctantly accept that, a number of thousands of people are going to get infected or die or whatever? Is that the right way of framing this in policy terms? And if it isn't, what is the right way? And if it is, what different decisions should we make?
I think to begin with, that seemed like the most sensible way to tackle this virus, because it was all so new. It took much of the world by surprise because of how it came out of China, because of the role that the World Health Organization played, etc., etc. At that time, I think there was very little to be done other than to say, we're just going to have to ride this storm and then hopefully come out of it better off with the least amount of damage that can be possibly expected to have done to our to have been suffered by both our population and the economy. What's worrying me now is that this has just gone on for so long, and it doesn't seem like anyone really has any idea what to do and how to get out of this. So we are blaming the government quite a bit. I was hearing your previous panelists voice their displeasure at how our own government has dealt with it, etc. But I actually have a little bit of sympathy for our own government as well, because I can't see anywhere else. I mean, Sweden's case is interesting, and we're still really seeing how it works works out ultimately for them. I don't think it is conclusive yet. But for the rest of the world, it is just, I think pretty much everybody's in the same boat as us and just trying to do the right thing. So I was just looking at the time frame as to what the scientific, well, not the scientific, but what the official guideline was, or what the official recommendation was on masks. And I think only in March it was that WHO, the World Health Organization, was saying if you for relatively healthy people, you don't have to wear masks. And there were questions around whether things would actually be worse if you were wearing masks, because you could not know how to wear it properly. You could touch an infected mask and touch other things and actually make things worse for everybody else. Just 2 weeks ago, WHO said governments should be encouraging people to wear masks. So if we do look at experts, and we have to, I think, when it comes to medicine and medical advice, the advice is confused as well. So what does a government do in these situations? It is really quite difficult to say this would have been the right thing to do. That is the wrong thing to do.
We're in uncharted waters, aren't we? I mean,
absolutely.
My running joke is there was a debate 2 or 3 years ago on whether we should ban the burqa, and we're now on the verge of making it compulsory. Right, that shows how much the advice changed. Maddie, let me come to you about the kind of economics of this and the trade-offs. And I was looking at a recent paper from Imperial College London, from Kamall, Professor of Economics there. And the suggestion is that a 1% fall in employment equates to a 2% rise in the prevalence of chronic disease. The OECD is now predicting unemployment could rise from, say, under 4% to nearly 15%. So that could mean an extra 3 million people could get a chronic disease. Do you think that it's not really now just a question of the trade-off, health or economics, that we're doing such damage to the economy, Maddie, that it could be a lose-lose-lose situation? We get poorer and unhealthier, and even if we crack the tail end of the COVID-19 virus, many other problems will afflict us because of the scale and nature of this lockdown. Madeline?
I completely agree. And I think that actually many of us on this side of the argument were making that point from the very beginning of the pandemic, that it could not simply be seen as solely a public health issue. If you ask a public health expert what kind of lockdown they would favour, they will come at it from purely a public health perspective, and their priority will be saving life in the short term at whatever cost, and that might lead you, for example, to choose the 2 metre rule over the 1 metre rule. But I think us libertarians and free marketeers have known from the beginning that poverty comes with a whole host of associated health problems, and not just that, but also we know now that there are huge problems with terrifying the public to the extent that people are scared to go into hospitals. It's created a big health problem that's coming down our road very soon. Undetected cancer cases, operations that have been delayed and will now be delayed to the winter at a time when the beloved NHS is inevitably in a winter crisis position. So I actually think that at the beginning of the pandemic, all of these matters were presented as very black and white. Those of us who raised them were accused of wanting to kill grandma or wanting to sacrifice people's lives for the sake of the economy. But I think that the passage of time will reveal more and more that you cannot disentangle human life from the economy. The two are inextricably linked. And not just that, but all kinds of other metrics as well. People's mental well-being, the development of children, and so on. It was never the false binary that the authoritarians were presenting it as.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, Maddie. But didn't, as you were saying, sort of free market or classical liberal or libertarian-minded folk were making these warnings sort of from the outset? But aren't we, Maddie, in the classic position that it's about whether the pain is dispersed or concentrated? And once everyone's laser focus is on the 6 o'clock news each night being how many people have contracted COVID-19, but we're not going to cover at all how many people have missed their cancer treatment today. Once the problem's dispersed, it's real, but the political class just isn't motivated to care about it sufficiently, even though in aggregate it could be worse.
Well, I think that the political class should care about this stuff very much, because ultimately they will get the blame for it. If it happened on their watch, that's what happens. The government that was in charge gets the blame for it. It might have been, for example, in the time that we went to war with Iraq in 2003, 2002, around that time, there was a majority of support in public opinion for that decision. And you could understand why ministers might look at those opinion poll findings and say, let's go to war with Iraq. But it doesn't matter if it's history will judge it differently, and history doesn't give a damn what the opinion polls were showing at the time. So really, politicians do have to be, I guess, brave and make these decisions and risk incurring some short-term displeasure and stick to their guns, stick to their principles.
Yeah, I've often taken that view. Politicians too much look at people's immediate stated preferences in an opinion poll, whereas actually what people want is a decent living environment and economic growth over 2 or 3 years. That's what they reward or punish politicians for, not their actions on any given day. Dia, let me come back to you. How worried, Dia, are you about the overall government spending? I mean, you were quite right in saying that right across the globe, everybody's been in largely the same boat. There have been different approaches, such as Sweden, but pretty much right across the board. Although I think the UK on public spending might be actually an outlier, a rather extreme case of public spending. We're seeing colossal, taxpayers' money being spent. We're going to see, billions, hundreds of billions wiped off the economy this year in terms of GDP going down. If £350 billion is wiped off the economy in terms of GDP going backwards, that's the equivalent of the entire budget for the NHS, education, the military, and the police force. What do you make, dear, of the state of the public finances? I mean, obviously, even libertarian-minded people can accept that you need to, spend when there's a war on, but we're going to have to austerity is going to have to come back, isn't it, Dia? I mean, we just haven't got the money to keep financing all of this.
That's, I think, one of the most important debates that we're not having at the moment, because our energy is being spent elsewhere. So Matt is right to talk about, or what we say, or actually you just mentioned, Mark, when the 6 o'clock news is focusing on coronavirus, which it needs to do at the moment. We completely understand that. We're not looking at how many cancer treatment or how many cancer operation surgery didn't happen that week. That's one of the debates. The other debate is, where is this money coming from? So if we are looking at a recession, and I think almost everybody agrees that we are now, where is the money going to come from? How are we going to fund this? And I think this is where going back to what Maddie was saying, this is where the people and economy, these two concepts ultimately being the same, becomes relevant again. Because if you are hurting the economy, then sooner or later it will be the people that you are hurting, because the two really are related. And I really am very worried that when all of this dies down, where is the money actually going to come from? If our behavior changes completely, for example, as to how much we buy, how much we consume, and of course that also means how much income is generated, etc. Everything changes, and we go from one uncharted territory to another, where we've got a population which is scared, where the behavior has changed completely from what we used to be like when we were in normal situations. And then what do? Do we actually have the bandwidth to deal with that? And where is that sort of financial economic cushioning going to come from?
Yeah, and surely, I mean, I'm trying to make this a matter of mathematics, not of ideology. But if let's say that GDP declines, national income goes down by 20%, Dia, we surely can't then say, well, we've got to spend more on the NHS and more on state pensions and more on schools and more on hospitals and more on international development aid. If the economy is contracted by 20%, then in very rough terms, don't we need public sector spending to contract by 20%? I mean, certain areas could, feel the pinch more than others. You might want to prioritise area X, and area Y has to take the hit. But don't you think, dear, we're in some sort of fantasy land where the economy is going to go backwards 20%, but everyone's going to say, but the NHS needs even more money and schools need even more money to catch up on the lost time and all of the rest of it?
And arguably, they will also be right that they will need more money in order to make up for all the losses that they've been suffering. You know, if we've completely failed to meet our cancer targets, for example, because of this, then we will have to pump in more money from somewhere to make sure that we can make up for lost time and lost treatment. Where is the money going to come from? Particularly as this being, you know, this is a global situation as well. If we're all having to contract, and if there's a global recession, where is that money actually going to come from? This is a very interesting and I think important and scary debate, I think, that we're simply not having the energy to have. And I would like to hear some ideas. I certainly don't have any, but it would be interesting to hear what people are thinking around that.
Yeah. I'm going to bring in, I want the dynamic duo from the Daily Telegraph to stay with us, but I'm going to bring in a couple of other guests, both of them from my very own IEA. So this is going to be a very civilised, the IEA meets the Daily Telegraph. Just before I do, Maddie, I want to come back to you with a particular question that's been raised on YouTube. How much do you think the government and politicians really were motivated or informed by the science or the economics in their deliberations? And how much do you think that it was just a question of public presentation, not wanting to seem to have blood on their hands, was the suggestion. They couldn't possibly do something that might look like it was mean to grandma, whatever the science and the economics suggested. What do you think was the motivation in their own mind, or perhaps they didn't even know?
Well, I think the term the science has really taken a battering during this pandemic, because it's emerged that there is no the science. There's a huge amount of expert divergence in opinion. And actually, that falling back on the science meant that politicians could often claim that what were actually very political decisions were in fact public health driven, and it was a way of passing the buck and abnegating responsibility. I think what happened was that their experts were telling them one thing, other countries' experts were telling their politicians to do something wildly different often. They were initially following that path, and then there was the terrifying modelling from Imperial College predicting hundreds of thousands of deaths, and particularly with under the pressure of Dominic Cummings, they then changed to adopting a different strategy. I don't know enough to know what was the right way to do. These are all kind of counterfactual questions. We may never know the truth. We may never come to a consensus, even after what the inevitable public inquiry in a few years' time. But I think one thing we can take from this is that expert opinion, I'm going to risk of echoing Michael Gove here, and we know how much trouble he got into for that line, but the limits of expert opinion, in the sense that it's not this amorphous thing that you can just fall back on. There's different experts' opinion. It's actually quite sensible for people to be criticising it, that no idea should be above proper debate, that people weighing in and asking questions will yield better outcomes, rather than the system that we had, which was a kind of sort of a mixture of technocracy and a really unpleasant civic culture, where people who raised questions were accused of really horrible and dishonest and of sort of borderline genocidal motives just for asking a few questions.
Okay, well, stay with us, Maddie and Dia, but I want to bring in two of our IEA staff, because I want to move the discussion on to the scale and the nature of the regulatory state that we live under. We've just been discussing what decision politicians have been making or failing to make in recent days, but are they really the people in charge? I want to move the discussion on to the regulators and who regulates the regulators. And to consider this, I'm really delighted to be joined by Victoria Hewson, the IEA's very own Head of Regulatory Affairs. Victoria, it's fantastic to have you back on the show. Welcome. And our very own Syed Kamall, the Academic and Research Director here at the IEA. Good evening, Syed.
Good evening.
Good to see you again. Long time no see. That's actually a complete lie. I had lunch with you, but great to see you.
Don't tell anyone. Well. I'm still in lockdown.
There you go. The cat's out of the bag. Victoria, wow. Good evening. How are you? Victoria? Great to see you. Now, Victoria, you've written this new report for the IEA, Who Regulates the Regulators. Your report focuses specifically, this first edition, on the Information Commission's office. But I wonder if I could start with you, Victoria, because the whole coronavirus pandemic lockdown has obviously seen an explosion in regulation, but hardly from a standing start, right? What's the what sort of burden does regulation place on the British economy in kind of financial terms? And who the hell's running this thing? Is it really in the hands of Boris Johnson, or do we have an administrative state that is sort of out of control? Victoria?
Yes, well, that's a great point. And I think one of the under-remarked costs of the lockdown and the panic situation that we're in actually has been potentially good governance, and proper scrutiny of lawmaking and enforcement has fallen away quite seriously. I mean, in terms of the burden that we were already facing, we pulled together some old calculations that had been made in the past in better regulation initiatives, and it runs to tens of billions of pounds a year in costs, both in terms of the compliance costs that businesses have to carry by employing lots of lawyers and compliance professionals, and also the opportunity costs in foregone investment and competition, innovation, and the loss of competition. And so the costs are almost incalculable in a very literal sense, because those kinds of lost opportunities are very, very difficult to calculate with any kind of certainty. And so in our report published today, we started a series kicking off case studies on individual regulators who we think are particularly important and potentially bring serious costs in the industries that they regulate. We focused on the Information Commissioner because, as a regulator, that essentially regulates the entire economy, including the public sector, civil society, everyone who has a database of employees or customers, from the smallest charity or local enterprise to the biggest multinationals, are all regulated by the Information Commissioner. So we had a good go at working out whether the current Information Commissioner and her teams are doing a good job or not, and is the regulatory framework there working as it should.
And what's your conclusion? I mean, you're right. If you're trying to regulate any company that holds any sort of data, particularly GDPR, a European Union initiative, but this is all the obligations you have to, if you've got information about people, how you handle it, what you... I mean, how much is this costing business? Do you have any sense? And is the Information Commission doing a good job? You're saying it's a tough job. That doesn't mean they're not doing a good job, right?
Yeah, so it's a really hard thing to measure, and it's made particularly difficult because the regulators themselves don't really make any proper effort at measuring their performance by reference to objective, measurable criteria. So we looked back at some of the old impact assessments that the European Commission had done to see what their cost-benefit analysis was of the GDPR, and it's actually dryly amusing, because they said it was going to be a deregulatory measure that would save business money and introduce competition and innovation into digital markets, which is, as I say, with hindsight, slightly hilarious, because the billions and billions of dollars that were spent in the scramble to get compliant, and we now know from lots of economic literature that certainly the short-term costs since the regulation came in have been that mainly Facebook and Google have benefited because they were able to drive competitors out of ad tech markets, and everyone else has kind of struggled. And there's been the other thing that we noticed in the literature that, for example, the Information Commissioner's Office themselves provide to tell ministers and parliamentary committees how well they're doing, is they measure their success by the number of complaints they get. So they don't really measure, is personal data better protected now? Are security...
And what, the fewer the complaints, the more successful the regulator?
No, the more complaints, the better.
The more complaints, the more successful the regulator. I couldn't even see how they measure it against that goddamn metric. Right.
No, the more complaints, the better, because that means there's greater levels of awareness.
Right. Okay. That seems to be an odd metric to strive for. But I think you can. I think you can get the Victoria's new report. She's the head of our regulatory affairs unit on the IEA's website. So, I want to come to you because prior to us at the IEA saving your soul and making you the academic and research director here, you were one of these filthy politicians running the European Conservative group in the European Parliament. So you must have seen fair measure of regulation. But there's one stat I want to put to you, which is about the scale of financial regulation here in the United Kingdom. I'm not blaming the European Union for this, or certainly not for all of it. And my source is Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the Bank of England. He pointed out that in 1980, in the finance sector of the UK economy, there was one full-time UK regulator for every 11,000 people employed in finance. And by 2011, there was one for every 300 people employed in finance. That ratio moving radically in, if you like, the wrong direction if you're a light touch regulation person. And I think on that trajectory, we'd actually have one regulator per finance worker by 2070 if we keep this up. What's going wrong here, Syed? Why is regulation growing and growing and growing, and why does it never get cut back?
I think a couple of reasons. One is that there's this belief that you can almost regulate all trouble away, or regulate away all risk. And so if you think about the financial crisis that we saw 2008, 2009, the immediate answer from the European Parliament, but not only the European parliaments across the world, was more regulation. There's been a problem. We need more regulation to solve this problem. But we already had lots of financial regulation. And one of the issues that I kept arguing with a number of colleagues was, well, hold on a minute, let's look what the problem was. First of all, we got ourselves into a situation where you allowed banks to believe that they were too big to fail, and you created moral hazard. That's what we should be tackling. Let's tackle what that issue is. Secondly, you had a problem, this gets very technical and geeky, I'm afraid, about accounting standards, where what you could do, you could book revenue, but you didn't have to make any provision for potential losses. And at one stage, AIG financial products exposed themselves to 2.8 trillion. No surprise that they toppled over. And the third thing was that no one took responsibility. Directors weren't taking responsibility for bad decisions. And they could make decisions. They could be bad decisions, and look what happened. The taxpayer bailed them out. Did any directors who made a bad decision, cost lots of money, pay any price? So therefore, rather than looking at what caused the problem, the solution was, I know what we need. We need more regulation. Surely more laws, and we got it wrong last time, and more laws will solve it next time. The other issue is clearly a political issue. As politicians, it's very difficult when a constituent writes a letter to you and says they've got a problem, and you say, sorry, I can't do anything about it, or actually that's your fault. You have to be seen to be doing something. And by having regulation, that's a sort of CYA, cover yourself, if you like, as a politician. And you say, oh, okay, tell you what.
I'm pretty sure the A stands for arse, not self.
Yeah, exactly. But of course, I was just, I wasn't sure whether we were at the watershed yet. And so therefore, politicians cover themselves by being seen to do something by saying, don't worry, I'm going to
something must be done. Yeah. Dia, I know you need to leave us very soon, but you as the Brexit editor at the Telegraph, wasn't the whole point about Brexit that it would give us the power to control our own regulations and deregulate? How's that project going for you?
Other than to get Syed out of Brussels into the IEA, you have us.
Yeah, that was a successful move. But I was looking at the more aggregate,
at a more macro level rather than micro.
Yeah, at a more macro level, exactly.
No, I was actually, even when we were when we were campaigning for Brexit, before I joined the Telegraph as its Brexit editor, we always heard from businesses, do you remember, that Brussels will make a law and Whitehall will gold plate it. So there was a long time where our own politicians were also hiding behind Brussels when they wanted to get in some restrictive regulations and just saying, look, we can't do anything about it. It's people like Syed putting it on us. So with Brexit happening, the transparency is most certainly hopeful. Most certainly, I was going to say most certainly, hopefully, that doesn't work. But the transparency really.
You're certainly hopeful. You're just not certain. Yeah.
Yes. Well, they can't really say now that it is Brussels pushing it onto us. This is all you. So whichever way it goes, they've got to own up to it and take responsibility for it. I said I was going to cheer you up. There's one thing that did cheer me up in this sort of market of heavy regulations is when they were opening up the restaurants and giving them license to have tables out on the pavement, etc. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I saw that the burden had shifted slightly onto the local authorities, in that businesses were going to be able to put their tables out after a very short period of time, after having applied for a license, and it was going to be on the local authorities to come back within a reasonable time to say, no, you can't do that. If they failed to do that, I think the government, I think the new regulation stated that the restaurants could go ahead and do it. Now, that is a very timid step, I accept. It's a tiny, tiny step. But I think these are the sort of things that we really need to look at and really need to applaud as well in order to encourage the government to open it up a little bit more. And I don't think a step change is going to come anytime soon, but I think small changes like that is possible and absolutely crucial to get the economy going again.
Okay, well, you've cheered me up a bit, dear. Let's see if you can cheer me up any more. Just before you go, I need your out of 10 rating. This is for the Live with Littlewood Optimism Barometer Index. And the question is, and as you see, Douglas and Toby even asked about the definition of the question earlier on the show. How optimistic are you about Britain being a free, prosperous, growing, wealthy, peaceful country in 2 to 3 years' time on a scale of 0 to 10?
7.
7. You are our most optimistic so far. So that's a kind of balanced optimism from Dia. Thank you very much, Dia. I know you need to go off and run. Maddie, let me quickly come back to you, Maddie. Where do you think we stand on the size and scale of the regulatory or administrative state? I know you can quickly sound like a kind of tinfoil hatted conspiracy theorist when you go on about this, but the scale of regulations in Britain just seem to me absolutely impenetrable. The cornerstone of our legal system is supposed to be that ignorance of the law is no defence, but it's impossible not to be ignorant of the law and all regulation. And what the heck do you think we need to do, Maddie, to start burning it, or at least trimming it back, or at least, let me be a bit more pessimistic, stopping its rapid growth?
But I mean, we've been promised the bonfire of the Quangos so many times, and it's never yet materialised. And I suspect that with the pandemic, the ongoing pandemic, and this massive matter of public health crisis, now is perhaps not the time that we're going to be seeing that kind of systemic reform. But I mean, I don't think it's tinfoil hatted at all. I mean, even the example that Victoria gave, where the metric has been deliberately designed, i.e. volume of complaints, to create more work for the regulator, that is precisely the problem. In fact, it's the what Adam Smith described as the conspiracy against the public. If you're being paid to regulate something, it's in your interest to design a system where you're forever needed and the importance of your job is of paramount importance. And there is all inevitably a mission creep with this kind of regulation. And at the same time, we've forgotten that for some professions, they're perfectly capable of regulating themselves. Accountancy is a great example. That there's a sense that things have to be done by this group of regulators, and I think it's not tinfoil hatted. It's classic public choice theory that there is an incentive to create more work for yourself.
So everything, but if that's, I mean, but the public choice theory that explains all of this, that's incredibly depressing, isn't it, Maddie? We're bound to lose. I mean, all we can say about the regulatory state is that it's bound to grow. How the hell do we get out of this?
Oh God, I don't know. I mean, you always invite me on, and then you want me to be optimistic, and then I'm never optimistic. And I'm sorry, it's one of those occasions. I do think, though, that I think decisions like Brexit. I know not everyone who voted for Brexit is a bleeding heart libertarian like us, but I think what that showed was a desire for laws to be made, decisions to be taken a bit closer to the people that they affect. I think there is a desire for sort of devolution in all sorts of ways, and I think you could argue that that's the same thing. That maybe if it was, if we were given the space to explain what's going on here, and I think there is a general distaste for the kind of regulatory busybodying and the quangocracy and all of that stuff, especially when what we've been seeing in recent months, it's very clear that a lot of these organisations have been taken over by left wingers. And therefore it's become, some of this stuff has become bound up with the culture war. So there is a perhaps new interest in all of this stuff that there wasn't before. But no, on the whole, I'm not particularly optimistic.
Well, we've also seen, before I let you go, Maddie, obviously I'll need your optimism score. So that worried me that you said that you weren't particularly optimistic. I mean, we've seen some incremental gains through the lockdown, that some regulations that were in place were sort of scrapped to allow restaurants to act as takeaways, to allow late night deliveries at supermarkets. I think it was Toby or Douglas who mentioned earlier that you can now sell pizza on a street corner. I mean, you probably have to wear a hazmat suit while you're doing it, but you can sell pizza on a street corner. Do you think we can make those incremental gains, or are we just sort of sinking into quicksand? I mean, if we're able to point to regulations that really are pointless, many of these I didn't even know existed, right? I mean, but they've been incinerated. But do you think that's the way we need to take it on, just kind of inch by inch, preposterous regulation by preposterous regulation? Or do you think we need to kind of incinerate whole Quango? You know, just say, sorry, that office of regulating X, Y, or Z is just going to be shut down?
I honestly don't know enough to have an answer to that question. I haven't followed it as closely as perhaps I should have done. But I think we need to set a new rule that, as in the past, historically, whenever a new tax has been implemented, we're told it's temporary, like income tax. It was meant to be a temporary levy to raise money for
the Napoleonic Wars, wasn't it? Yeah.
And of course,
that one's been done. Yeah.
It's with us now, and things like stamp duty were meant for particularly very, very wealthy homes, and now they apply to all sorts of middle income ones as well. I think we need to set a new rule now that these temporary deregulations need to become permanent. We need to stick our spear in the ground on that, as the left have been so much better at doing this historically than we have. I think we need to try and hold on to these things, because really it's common sense. I mean, why shouldn't a pub be able to sell something takeaway if it wants to, pandemic or no pandemic? I think a lot of people could really relate to that and say, you know, what's going to be a tough time economically, why shouldn't we hold on to these deregulations, and what was the point of them in the first place?
Okay, well, listen, Maddie, the intonation of your voice is relatively upbeat and bouncy. So give me your Live with Littlewood number. What's your optimism number between 0 and 10, 2 to 3 year time horizon? How optimistic are you feeling?
Oh, okay. Sorry, boring explanation. I think before the last few days have taken me probably from a 5 to like a 4 or 3, because I don't have actually particularly strong feelings about masks, but I think the fact that this has been brought in at this stage of the pandemic, the ordination to wear them inside shops, and the fact that there's speculation it's going to be rolled out to workplaces, that to me suggests that this new normal situation is going to be with us for quite a while longer than I had assumed. So I would probably have revised a more optimistic 5 or 6 to a more depressing 4 or 3 on that basis.
Okay, well, I need to force you to an integer. I can't do half numbers. My long multiplications.
4. Let's go with 4.
4. All right. Okay. You were sounding more optimistic than you really are. That's just your lovely, bubbly voice, Maddie. Lovely to have you with us. Have a great evening. Terrific to have with you. Speak soon, Maddie. Delighted to be joined by our last 2 guests, and Syed and Victoria stay with us. Victoria, I know you've got to leave us in a few minutes' time, but I do want your thoughts on this issue. Delighted to welcome back to the programme Sam Bowman, Director of Competition Policy at the International Centre for Law and Economics and Senior Fellow at the Adam Smith Institute. And Tom Whipple, my cousin, but more importantly, the science editor over at The Times. So we're going to focus on one particular regulation here. This is the compulsory wearing of face masks in shops from July the 24th, on pain of the police issuing you with a £100 fine. I think I've got the gist of the regulation and the law right there. So a standout, because it's, if you like, goes counter to the general liberalising of lockdown. Tom, good evening to you. Lovely to have you with us.
Good evening. Hello.
And Sam, welcome back to the show. Great to have you back. Tom, I'm going to start with you. You kindly shared some time with us previously on the IA channel about the science around face masks and you know, whether they could be proven to work or not. Or if they couldn't be proven to work, whether you could still sort of, you know, assume that they would work. What do you make of this new regulation? Is this a giant leap forward for improving public health?
I think it's a perfectly sensible move forward for improving public health. It's one of these weird things that, I mean, can something not be a culture war? I mean, if people had told us that 6 months ago, well, what your opinion on chloroquine would be a culture war item, and similarly on face masks, I mean, we'd have thought the world has gone mad, and obviously the world has gone mad. Look, face masks, the evidence that they work isn't great. The evidence they cause harm is pretty low. it's quite plausible that these will help control transmission, and people are, getting into a tiz over something that, frankly, we wash our hands, we wear face masks, get over it. This is not worth a stand on.
That's really interesting. Tom, I'm going to come back to you on whether everything's a culture wars point. I was saying earlier in the programme that 2 or 3 years ago, there was an argument about whether we should ban the burqa, and now the case seems to be that we're going to make the burqa compulsory in one form or another. So perhaps everything is disappointingly a culture war. Victoria, I know you need to leave us soon, but I must come back to you for the IEA's head of regulatory affairs view of the face mask thing. Is Tom right? Is it just that there's a bunch of lunatic libertarians like you and I who just object to being told to do anything, however sensible it might be? And, what's the harm in this face mask thing? Are you with Tom on this sensible bit of science, or is this an egregious infringement of my basic rights not to wear a mask, Victoria?
Yeah, I actually think it is fairly egregious, not because I have any comment on whether or not people should wear masks. I think the evidence, from how I understand it, the evidence is quite limited, especially in terms of wearing homemade sort of underpants over your face sort of masks that we're seeing as being a perfectly permissible way to meet these regulations. There's really no evidence that that kind of thing works at all. And for me, as someone who values freedom and civil liberties, the bar must be set higher than, well, it won't do any harm, before we introduce mandatory public health measures backed by the force of the criminal law. And I think in particular, as I mentioned before, I think good governance has been a bit of a crisis, a casualty of this crisis, because we have not actually even seen the text of these regulations yet. They were announced yesterday. We haven't seen the text of the regulations. So as usual, the government is playing catch up in actually maintaining any semblance of the rule of law, in publicising what the law actually is going to be. We've seen that throughout the period of the lockdown. The regulations were being amended. Nobody knew what they ever were from time to time, including, or especially, the police. And I fear in this case, the police have already said they're not delighted about having to go around enforcing this. They've got better things to do. Several, I understand, supermarkets have come out and said they're not going to enforce it, or more to the point, they're not going to force their staff, their long-suffering, hard-working staff, to go around enforcing this. So I think there's a strong danger we're going to end up with another law on the books that is going to be enforced either not at all or arbitrarily. And the rule of law and good governance goes out the window. I think it's particularly egregious because it seems to me that the government hasn't made any real effort to try and explain why they now think we should be wearing masks, whereas the guidance that was introduced and is still up there, if you check on the Health and Safety Executive and all the government guidance, as actually they don't really think masks are particularly helpful in most scenarios outside of healthcare. So where has been the effort to try and educate the public to what they clearly now think is the new science that they didn't believe before, but now they do, rather than moving straight to a coercive measure? And I have a sneaking suspicion it's more reactive politics to try and encourage nervous people out to the shops. And, I hesitate to invoke a slippery slope argument, but if this is now the bar we set for mandatory public health measures that could give people a criminal record, I'm not really delighted about that.
Okay, I don't know if you're willing to share with us, Victoria, before I ask for your out of 10 Live with Littlewood optimism barometer rating out of 10. How do you think people who share your and my sort of libertarian leading concerns will react? Will we just go along with it and deal with the inconvenience? Or I guess some people might consider it, grotesque infringement on their right to express themselves. Will we just buy everything off Amazon? Will we defy the law and see whether Tesco's do actually call the police if we go in with an inadequate mask? What do you think the reaction of people will be? Or will we just meekly comply, which seems to be what happens with most regulations in Britain?
Well, I will certainly comply. I don't generally go about breaking the law if I can possibly avoid it.
You're on the non-radical wing of the IEA, I see.
I probably will shop more online, but more out of a gesture than any particular aversion to wearing a mask, because I don't particularly mind wearing a mask. This is the point. I mind it being made mandatory with the threat of criminal proceedings against me. And I will say as well, I fear mostly that this just gives more ammunition to the censorious busybodies who've been monitoring how many times their neighbours go out for exercise, and are you sitting on a park bench when you shouldn't be. Here where I am at the moment, at my parents' place in Northumberland, they've got a pedestrian one-way system. And I witnessed 2 days ago a local bully, middle-aged man, shouting at elderly people who were stepping out of shops and heading off in the wrong direction. This is just giving even more ammunition to these people to go around shouting and bullying at people who they don't think are complying with whatever they think the law is. So yes, of course I'll comply. However, on balance, of course I will comply with the law.
Okay, there you go. Yeah, complaining but complying. Victoria, thanks again for your great paper for the IEA today, which you'll be able to get on the IEA's website, iea.org.uk. Victoria, what's your optimism rating? Give me a number, 0 to 10. 10 is that libertarians like you and I triumph in short order. 0 is we're North Korea before you know it.
Well, I actually very much agree with what Maddie just said. I was probably more optimistic before this measure came in because of all of the indicators that I think it gives. So I think we will be a safe and peaceful country, but I'm not sure we'll be a particularly prosperous country in the next 2 to 5 years, or whatever your time horizon was. So I'm going to go with a 4 as well.
4, okay, this is all a bit dispiriting. Victoria, thanks for joining us. I'm sorry we've kept you just beyond your scheduled dinner time. It's lovely to see you. See you again soon, I hope, in person. Sam, thank you for your patience. Great to have you back on the show, Sam. And I should say about Sam, a man of great liberal, classical liberal, neoliberal, I think he describes himself as, instincts, but always comes up with something completely counterintuitive that often enrages me, and I'll have a screaming match with him over the dinner table. So let's see if I'm going to have a screaming match with him over YouTube tonight. Sam, give me your take on the face mask issue. Is this the right move, the wrong move? What would you do? Is this a thumbs up or a thumbs down to this infringement or obligation on us?
Well, I don't think it's counterintuitive at all. I think right from the very start, anybody who's followed the existing evidence has thought that masks probably do something. Japan has somehow managed to avoid any major spike. I think, in fact, there are now randomized controlled trials that show that masks work. There's basically no doubt at all that masks work. But the argument that people like you and Victoria are making isn't that masks don't work. It's that masks do work, but it's not worth it, that there's some kind of imposition. And I read your piece from the other day in the Telegraph, and I really, really took issue with it. And to be honest, I think that it's exactly the wrong kind of argument that libertarians or liberals should be making. You say, now that we know about the disease, you're now in a good position to judge your own tolerance to the risk of exposure based on your own personal and familial circumstances. But the whole point of an epidemic is that there are externalities to your behavior, that it is not just yourself that is at risk, it's other people that's at risk. And the whole point of masks is that it's not protecting you from other people with the disease, it's protecting other people from you carrying the disease unbeknownst to yourself. So the whole point here is that we can't rely on individual action because the incentives are wrong. The same goes for if we had no laws against pollution, or if we had no laws against you playing loud music in your house until 4 o'clock in the morning. All of the standard arguments around externalities apply here. And I think it's really crazy that there are libertarians, or people who say they're libertarians, who seem to think that libertarianism means you can spew out negative externalities, whether it's a disease or pollution, without any kind of recourse from other people. Now, in a kind of libertarian paradise, which we don't live in, and I don't think is possible, people would sue each other. And if you came into Tesco with this disease and you spread it to a few people and killed a few of them, then their families would sue you and you go bankrupt. Or maybe you go to jail because you couldn't pay them off. Now, we don't live in that world. So we need government, unfortunately, to step in as a backstop. And we do that in lots of other areas. I'm sure you think that there should be rules about what side of the road you drive on and what side of the road you don't drive on. There's another example. Maybe not. fair enough. That's a fair point. Most people think that there should be rules about things like that. Most people think you shouldn't be able to spray poison into playgrounds. Those are all examples of externalities. And it's not libertarian to think that externalities don't exist. And it's not libertarian to think that externalities should be allowed to be spewed out without recourse.
But it's actually, before I come back to Tom, no, I mean, I agree, Sam, and I think actually the segment I wrote for the Telegraph was edited out, and I completely agree that this is an other regarding activity. It isn't actually about self-protection. The point I was trying to get across is there are surely differences, and you might be right that the transaction costs of dealing with them are too high, but there are clearly differences, not just between young people and old people, but between, say, young people who live with their elderly grandparents and young people who only fraternize with other people in their 20s.
Because it's not as simple as that, because I shop in the same supermarket as elderly people. I live next door to elderly people. It's everybody does. It's not like we live in a world.
So you think it's a public good problem, basically?
It doesn't have to be anything like that. It's very, very simple case of externalities. There is no way of just bifurcating old people away from the rest of the population. And by the way, getting COVID as a young person can be really unpleasant. You can die. You can be given permanent lung damage. Getting COVID as somebody who's under the age of 60 is not a pleasant experience for many people. So acting like this is a thing that only affects old people is really, really misleading, I think. And
no, it doesn't. I wasn't suggesting that. It disproportionately affects different demographics.
Right. So
I'm not suggesting anybody under the age of 50 is immune.
Really bad. This is really bad. It is especially bad if you're elderly. It can be really bad if you're young, and it can be pretty bad if you get it and you're of any age. So this question about masks is first of all really strange on that. Secondly, what I'm completely amazed by is people like you who've spent months telling us how bad lockdown is, how costly lockdown is, completely correctly about how expensive lockdown is, now saying that it's not worth even requiring people to wear masks in supermarkets if that makes a second lockdown less likely. So you've now basically thrown out every other argument you've made about lockdown, and you're now saying, well, actually, all of that stuff we were saying about lockdown, forget about it, because this rule against wearing masks in supermarkets, that's even worse. Even the £300 billion that we've saddled ourselves with because of lockdown and the number of people out of work and so on, all of that, forget about it.
Okay, let me bring Tom back in, although he's probably going to vociferously agree with you. I mean, I'm also sceptical about the efficacy. If I could be persuaded that wearing masks in supermarkets would be the difference between a second lockdown and not, that would weigh with me. I'm not persuaded of the efficacy. But Tom, I want to come back to a discussion we were having on the channel some time ago. You've been very honest about admitting that it's not overwhelming levels of science. You've been, I think, very fair by not falling into the trap of saying, if we bring in this rule, exactly X number of lives will be saved. We can't really know, but it seems to be in broadly the right direction. But what I want to press you on is whether you would apply this more generally. I mean, should actually mask wearing become a norm? I mean, it's much more of a cultural norm in some other countries, that it would prevent, I mean, I appreciate COVID-19 is considerably more dangerous than the common cold, but it could prevent the transmission of other illnesses as well. Should it be potentially a general expectation in future, or a general expectation at the time of seasonal flu for sake of argument, Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I'd actually, you're going to paint me into a corner, but I actually think that, in Asia, they've sort of got quite a good idea of this. We blithely transmit disease all the time to people. That's quite nasty. Even a common cold is quite an injury to give to someone from just a random meeting. And we accept this as a cost of living. But I don't particularly think it needs to be. So yes, if this prompts, in the same way as people really very strongly objected to the idea of washing their hands when this was first introduced, why not, if you're feeling a bit sniffly, wear a cold when you go out? I mean, it's not insane. The evidence, by the way, for this is getting stronger. Yes, we don't have a lot of the really gold standard trials on wearing masks, but more and more is coming through. There's natural experiments. There was a lovely example that you can use from Germany, where different cities locked down at different times, and it was sort of a natural experiment. Or rather, didn't lock down. They mandated the use of masks on public transport at different times. And you could see quite strong effects in the transmission. It's not perfect. There was a study out today, which again isn't perfect, but looked at 2 hairdressers who both had COVID, one of whom wore masks and passed it on to a significant proportion of her 100-odd clients in that time, and the other one who didn't wear a mask, who did wear a mask, didn't pass it on to any. So the evidence is accumulating. It's never going to be perfect for everyone. But yes, I find myself in vociferous agreement with Sam, as you said. I felt I was the token wet in this conversation and the only person who
I told you Sam would be counterintuitive. He's often the token wet in IEA discussions as well, so you're not alone.
Unfortunately, the wet thing here is being so afraid of using the state to save people's lives that you're in fact wanting them to hold back entirely. I mean, the wet thing here is to want complete passiveness and to just want to lie down in the face of a deadly pandemic. That's the wet thing. The dry thing is to want to step in and take strong action to stop the disease, which I'm glad we're finally doing.
I agree, but I think Tom's right in saying that's most people wouldn't consider that to be the instinctively libertarian position. And so I'll come back to you, Sam, in just a moment, and I want Syed's thoughts. Although, blimey, I'm just supposed to be the neutral presenter here. I'm a bit worried it's going to be 3-1 against me. What the hell's the IEA doing on these goddamn broadcasts? We're supposed to be educating people about free market libertarian solutions. But Tom, the point of it that I wanted to get to in terms of how you frame public policy, appreciate you're on the science side, and as I said, you've been very honest about the balance of science, but perhaps the evidence moving in the direction of masks of a certain type being helpful in stopping the transmission of disease. But at some point, there needs to be a trade-off. Now, I'm actually not of the view that saying you need to wear a mask to come into this supermarket is the most egregious assault on somebody's individual liberty you could ever imagine. But let's extend that argument. Supposing, and I'm guessing this is the case, you can contradict me, Tom, if I'm wrong, that the transmission of disease would be a lot less if people had to wear a hazmat suit every time they left their house. We would radically reduce the spread of COVID-19, the common cold and everything else. There would be a cost involved, not just of everybody having to buy a hazmat suit, but you've got to put it on in the morning, you've got to go into your office, you've presumably got to keep it on in your office. Do you think there's some balance here? I mean, that's obviously, I'm not suggesting anyone's posing that, but it seems to be on the spectrum between, let's assume that would stop the spread of COVID-19. Sort of, why would we be against that and in favour of other measures? Isn't there a balance between stopping transmission on the one hand, even if you're sure it would, and the level of inconvenience or cost associated with doing so?
Yeah, I mean, yes, there is a balance, and maybe you'll find the point where you've got this perfectly poised equilibrium between the inconvenience and the ability to stop the country going into a second lockdown. I think the level of inconvenience of wearing a mask when you go into a shop is probably not at it. And I'd have to sort of reiterate what Sam said. It's not about you. It is about other people, but there really is no way in which you can say, this is where, I'm with my granny, I wear it, I don't. Because the very fact of having this transmitting, even among healthy people, even if you somehow only manage to sneeze on healthy people, the very fact of maintaining the transmission of the virus is the danger. And this is why, for naive libertarianism, if I may say, this is a real philosophical crisis, because this is a purely collective problem, and we only get out of it in a collective way.
No, I mean, I think that's a fair challenge. I mean, libertarians do tackle and try and find solutions to public good problems. And I think libertarians would accept that public good problems are where there needs to be state, collective or coercive action. I would consider myself broadly a libertarian, but I'm not an anarchist. I'm just saying the hurdle that I think you need to clear before moving to action. Syed, help me out here. You're not going to help me out, are you, Syed? You're going to say they've got it bang on right, and I'm a tinfoil hat nutter, and you're amazed that you ever came to work for me. Is that going to be, if I summarise your thoughts correctly?
That sums it up perfectly. Yes. No, but I mean, you and I have had lots of discussions, and one of the things that we're quite clear about is that the IEA should be a forum for discussions around liberty. That's what we should be doing. There is no corporate view of what freedom or liberty is, and we should be that place where people can come along and debate these ideas. What does that mean from my perspective? I'm always very concerned when people have this view of liberty as being the freedom to do what the hell you want, regardless of the consequences. And also, there is a person. I mean, if you are going to be an extreme view of personal liberty to do what you want. What is the liberty that's been infringed upon here? Is it, so someone's infringing upon my liberty to infect other people with a potentially fatal disease? Surely we should be looking at it in that perspective. And this is actually where I do agree with the two other guests. It is not as simple as saying, I have this freedom to do what I want. And read your Hayek. What does Hayek say? With freedom comes responsibility. Now, why is this advice changed? Because at the beginning there simply wasn't enough data. When you read when the CDC in the United States says, I was asked this question, why have you changed your advice? They said, look, we've now got more data. And it's another example of sort of the Hayekian discovery process. We get more data, we see what's working. If the data was saying that masks make no difference, or there are other things that make a difference, I'm sure the government would have advised that. And going right back to what you were saying, what we were saying at the beginning about regulation and laws, politicians or people are looking to our political leaders at the moment, and they expect some direction and some leadership there. And politicians have to be seen to be doing something. And given now that the data seems to be shifting in a direction which says, if we wear masks, this will stop us transmitting the disease, then you expect government to act at that time. And also, we want to get the economy going again. I completely agree with Sam's point. Surely, if this gives people who are slightly concerned about going out and being sneezed upon by someone not wearing a mask, if it gives them the confidence to go out, and people who are potentially marginally vulnerable or vulnerable to go out and get the economy going, surely that's a good thing. So I think this is part of the debate. I think libertarians can disagree on this. And this is why I think, I don't think it's that much of an infringement of my liberty.
No, I mean, I should be clear on that as well. I'm not taking a kind of Charlton Heston, I will never ever wear this, sort of line. I don't consider this to be the most fundamental liberty that I have. I'm just trying to raise skepticism about it. And Sam, that's where I want to come back to you, because it is you're quite right. Another folk have pointed out, this is another regarding activity. You could either look at it economically as an externality problem, but one with transactions costs, as you say. You don't want everybody suing each other because their face mask, they didn't wear a face mask in Tesco's. It just becomes a nightmare. Far easier to have a rule or a law. But if you like, I am going to use a slight slippery slope argument, Sam, is that vast amounts of human activity are actually other regarding in some way or another. A decision about whether you resign your job might have a massive impact on your family's welfare, but we would usually say is an individual's decision whether they resign their job. Your longevity, about your diet and what you eat and what you drink, that has all sorts of externality factors. If you drink too much beer, and I'm only on my second of this evening, so I should be all right, you're more likely to cause an accident, so on and so forth. And so my question to you, Sam, was if the kind of hurdle was just that the activity is other regarding, and that therefore legitimizes state mandatory potentially criminalized regulatory approach to it, aren't you opening the floodgate, and you might legitimately say that you are, to a whole range of other things that the government could say, well, let's do this because it's other regarding, there's an externality here, therefore we're going to bring in this rule and this law that you need to organise your personal finances in a particular way because it could have an impact on your family if you don't. You can imagine the whole tidal wave of things which are indeed other regarding. So why do you, Sam, allow this one through and not potentially a raft of others?
Well, I mean, obviously, anything that's illegal is in some way illegal because it's other regarding. I mean, murder is illegal because you're imposing the ultimate cost on somebody else. I mean, by your logic, we would be questioning whether murder should be illegal. The question is, where do you stop doing that? The question is, at what point does the harm become tolerable, and in such a way that we are allowing people to inflict that kind of harm on other people? And in most of the cases you've mentioned, we do have laws against us. I mean, you aren't allowed to drink and drive, and I think that's probably a good thing. Although maybe we think we've drawn the line in the wrong place. The reason here it's such a no-brainer is that the cost of getting COVID and the cost of spreading COVID to other people is really, really high because it's really, really likely to kill a lot of people. I won't rattle through the sums, but I did a few sums because I thought you might ask me a question like this before before the show, and I worked it from both ways. So I tried to figure out how many people would need to die, or for a given kind of willingness to pay of British households not to wear masks, how many people would need to die for it to not be worth it. And if every household in the UK was willing to pay £100 to not have to wear a mask when they went for their weekly shop, or the number of people that we would need to prevent from dying was 1,350. And that seems really low, because dying is really bad, and the statistical value of a life that we place is really, really high. It's about £2 million per life. So even a very, very small number of people dying, 1,300, would need quite a high willingness to pay. I certainly wouldn't be willing to pay £100 to avoid wearing masks.
Could I just clarify, Sam, because I don't know the number. I'm just trying to clarify here. Are you saying that it is your belief that this face mask regulation will indeed save 1,300 lives? I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just trying to clarify that that's what I mean.
Obviously,
some people are telling me it's going to save zero.
Well, those people are like people who say that vaccines give you autism. I mean, people who tell you that are basically liars or charlatans.
But you think it's 1,300?
People, no. That's an illustrative example of, if every household was willing to pay £100, how many lives would need to be saved for it to be worth imposing this rule on them. So it's such a low number. I have no idea how many lives will be saved. I suspect it's many more than that. But just to be clear, people who are saying it's not going to save any lives are basically people who say that vaccines give you autism. They're complete charlatans, and I think they're basically liars, because anybody who says that in a public forum,
or they're
really
willing it to be true,
same thing really. But we can work it from loads of different directions. The point is, to answer your question, it's the amount of harm that you cause to other people. We do think it's probably okay for you to throw a paper airplane in a playground, because it's very unlikely to cause a lot of harm. We don't think it's okay for you to throw a grenade in a public playground, because it probably will cause a lot of harm. And yeah, there's a grey area between those things, but this is much more like throwing a grenade in a public playground than it is like throwing a paper airplane in a public playground.
Okay, so it does seem to be on the overall balance of risk. I should just clarify, although I consider myself a fairly ideological libertarian, I'm not in favour of a free market in murder. I do draw the line there, just in case any of our viewers were thinking about that. Tom, I wanted to come back to you, which goes back to, and Victoria, in fairness, said it's not always the most comfortable argument to use, but the slippery slope argument. How does one get out of this if you wanted to? Is there some point at which you would say, Tom, well, if R has fallen to, I don't know, 0.02 or something, then at that point we should deregulate this? Or is there a case for saying, and maybe you would warmly welcome this, that we bring this in because of the pandemic, but it stays in place to deal with seasonal flu, for sake of argument, or some such like? Or do you think those who bring in these regulations should have the sort of, well, it's brought in order to stop X, but once we can show that X has been stopped, R has fallen to a particular number, or the number of infections every day is low, or we found a vaccine, then we will end it? Or do you think it just carries on forevermore?
I mean, look, we've had a lot of very special regulations introduced in the past 6 months. I think this is quite clearly one of them. I would expect it to continue until we have a vaccine, because until we have a vaccine, no matter what level the infections are at, basically the argument's the same. I mean, I've been writing about this week a piece that's yet to come out about super spreaders. It seems like a large proportion, perhaps the majority of this disease is spread by in these super spreading events, which are a sort of mixture of biology and environment, which is probably why places like Israel have seen these sudden spikes. So even if it's at a low level, it's an unstable equilibrium. So I'd expect that to continue. After that, no, I don't think we should be keeping this law on the books for seasonal flu. But what I would hope is that we've affected a behavioural change, so that much as in the Far East, where we used to quite happily mock the Chinese travellers who come over here for tourists wearing their masks, we start to think that actually the polite thing for us to do, if we have a cold and we're outside, is to wear a mask, because why the hell not?
Let me come back to you, Sam, because the question I wanted to ask was, even if all of the theory is right around sort of preventing the externality, this is, even for people of a classical liberal perspective, a classic example of when the state should intercede for a public good or an externality issue. Do you think there are problems of definition here? I mean, there seems to be an argument about whether pret-a-manger is a shop or a restaurant. I'm not quite sure, and Victoria made the point earlier, what the definition of a face covering is. It's not specifically a mask. I don't know whether if you just hold a sock over your mouth and your nostrils, that counts. Do you think there might then be over enforcement, or sort of, that it might encourage a more condemnatory culture? That even if you wanted to bring this in, do you think there are definitional problems around, it's being brought in shops, not in pubs and restaurants? I mean, you can understand why, because eating and drinking with a face mask on is difficult. Not impossible. I guess you could keep, pulling it up and pulling it down. We haven't specified the nature of the covering. I mean, I made the slightly flippant point about demanding a hazmat suit. It's a face covering. I mean, I think you can literally wear a sock with an elastic band and you're within the law. Don't you sort of immediately run into all of those sort of the what Hayek might call the fatal conceit, that you sort of design this as a state intervention, but it becomes basically impossible to define it in a way that's satisfactory, and there's all sorts of grey areas and arguments about definitions, and that leads to all sorts of conflicts?
Well, no, I mean, I'm a Hayekian when it comes to law, so I think that problems like that should be sorted in courts. I don't want the government to specify the dimensions of the face covering that I'm supposed to be wearing. I want that to be basically common sense. And when it seems that common sense is being violated, then we hash it out in a court of our peers. That's the Hayekian way, and that's how we work our way through the really difficult kind of obscure edge cases of law. So no, I don't see a problem with that. I do see a problem with I think that the fact that the entire medical establishment was recommending that we do not wear masks a few months ago, and now has turned around and said, oh no, of course you must wear masks. That does seem to be a big problem, and I worry that a lot of people kind of correctly have kind of become very skeptical of those people because of that. And because of other things, and now incorrectly are kind of thinking, well, I shouldn't listen to them on this, I shouldn't listen to them on the masks. That's the sort of thing I'm worried about, rather than the kind of precision of the legislation.
Syed, let me come back to you on that as our academic and research director, but also as a former senior elected politician. There's a real problem, isn't there, about this sort of search for certainty? I mean, I'm not furious with the political establishment about they're changing their mind about masks. It might well be that the science develops. What we thought was true in March turns out to be less true now, or whatever. It's permanently refined. Science is a Hayekian discovery process. But Syed, do you think there's a problem in politicians communicating with the electorate? I mean, one of the things that they're always accused of, or often accused of, is, that will send a mixed message. Well, sometimes the message you want to send might very well be mixed rather than black or white. It might actually be, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. We're going to take this sort of course down the middle. How do you think politicians should deal with scientific uncertainty, and particularly this view of, are you following the science? And then they sort of say, well, I am, because I've got somebody who can claim to be a scientist who's written this report and I'm following it. But that's not really following the science, right?
Yeah, I think politicians have to be explicit up front and say, how they make their decisions, and and if they've changed their mind, why a decision has been changed, or why they've made a new decision. And if they had said at the beginning of this crisis, look, we're all in a process of discovery here. We don't have all the answers. There are countries that are going to try it different ways. Our current scientific evidence tells us, and remember at the beginning, the politicians were surrounded by scientific advisors on either side. You say, no, our current scientific evidence tells us this, therefore we're going to follow this. But if we find evidence from other countries, or we get more data suggest that we change tack, we will let you know. But we don't have all the answers right away. The problem is, as a politician, is if you say that, you sometimes worry about being seen to be weak, or you worry about changing your mind, is being inconsistent. How many times have you seen a politician, a journalist digs up something against a politician and says, you say this now, but 5 years ago at a speech in Dudley or on Merseyside, you said that. Surely you're inconsistent. Can we trust you on anything? And the correct answer, as far as I'm concerned, says, well, at that time, I made that decision based on the information. But this and this has happened since then. It's more difficult for politicians to say that, but I think they can say it. And interestingly enough, sometimes when you see politicians who've and other experts who've said, oh, I've changed my mind because of new evidence, people say, fair dues, that's fair enough. I don't know. I mean, Tom, would you challenge a politician who gave some evidence, a few years ago about something and then just changed their mind now and said, well, actually, I've now got more data? Or would you say, well done for being so open about it?
I hope I would say well done for being so open about it. Bear in mind, my career until 6 months ago involved writing about dinosaurs and asteroids, and suddenly I've been thrust.
You got that wrong.
But you're absolutely right about following the science. I've literally absolutely wishing to name drop. I've just got off a telephone call with the Prime Minister of Sweden, who was absolutely following the science, and there was and remains a lot of uncertainty. And one of the things I would love that would happen after this is having a public that's more au fait and more comfortable with uncertainty, so that we can have exactly the situation inside where actually politicians can front up and say, I am following the science. The science has given me 3 different branching points that are very hard to choose between. This is where we are. That's reality.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Tom, I want to ask you, Tom, before I get everybody's optimism numbers, which, my God, they can't be much worse than the guests we've had on previously. Tom, how do you think, how would you rate politicians and public officials' ability to deal with the science? Do you think that, by and large, they are open-minded, trying to do their best, appreciate the levels of uncertainty, or do you think that it's, they've reached their conclusion and then grasp for whichever scientific, empirical study supports their initial prejudice? What's your broad view in Britain of how our public officials and our great leaders deal with the evidence?
I am unfashionably going to say that I think they've sincerely tried to do. I don't think anyone. Now everyone's got their stances. I don't think anyone came into this with some sort of entrenched ideological position, with the possible and notable exception of Rory Stewart, who had seen an Ebola outbreak happen and was from the beginning very pro-lockdown. But I've seen those original SAGE papers. They were receiving conflicting, confusing advice because that's the nature of the situation, and I don't think anyone was invested, had ideology, or wanted to do anything other than make a really good fist of this. This is where we are.
And I got a question in from YouTube, which I'll just put to each of you as I ask you for your optimism number, which is how free, prosperous, and peaceful a society will we be in 2 to 3 years' time? But the question here, so let me start with you, Tom, and then ask for your optimism number. We're being asked, would the panel challenge someone in a shop who wasn't wearing a mask? So you're going about your shop in Asda or Lidl or Waitrose in your case, Tom, I'm sure, and there's somebody who's not wearing a mask. What are you going to do? Do you have a word with them? Do you reach for your mobile phone and phone 999 immediately? What's your action in that regard?
God no. I'm British. I would tell people about it afterwards, I'd imagine, and I might look at them after they've turned their back on me. But no, that would be as far as I would go. And realistically, look, we talk about police enforcing this. This is never a police enforcement thing. This is people do it or don't do it, and societal disapproval is what makes it happen or not happen. My optimism, I am relatively optimistic that I hope that in 2 to 3 years we might be back to where we are economically, but it's going to be really
back to sort of February 2020.
Yeah, but I think it's going. I'm as if not more worried about the economy than I was about the pandemic, and that's not to say the two are traded off, one links to the other, but I think we've got a far tougher time going into winter with mass redundancy and not being able to stand outside in the sun. I think it's going to be really grim for a period.
Sam, what will you do to the recalcitrant, hardcore, naive libertarians who aren't wearing a mask in the retail outlet that you have to be visiting? What would your reaction be?
Well, ideally, they'd all be in jail or maybe horsewhipped or something like that. Unfortunately, because
Very
we don't live in-
old school punishment.
if we lived in a libertarian utopia, we'd have such good police enforcement, then there wouldn't be any problem because those people would automatically be punished. Unfortunately, we've got such a crappy state provision of security that probably a lot of people will break the law like that. I probably wouldn't challenge them because I'm a bit of a coward, but on the other hand, I do love drama, so I might do it just to make a scene.
Depend on your mood at the time, right?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But you're talking me into the face mask thing now. It might lead to the free market reform of the police service. If that had been your argument, you would have had me at the start, Sam. And how optimistic are you feeling, Sam? So the next 2 or 3 years, peace, prosperity, well-being and growth in the UK in 2 to 3 years' time.
Well,
number out of 10. I'm not sure Tom gave me a number. He said he was quite optimistic. What was your number, Tom?
My number, I think, would be 6.
6, okay. And Sam, same metric.
Last time I think I said 8. Since the mask debacle, I think I'm going to downgrade that to a 7 because I think, sadly, so many liberals and free marketeers in the UK have discredited and embarrassed themselves on this that they're going to be ignored and laughed at on loads of other issues that really do matter. So, unfortunately, I think the prospects are a little bit worse now than they were a few weeks ago. But on the other hand, a few fewer people will be dead, so that's good.
Okay, Syed, I've disgraced and embarrassed myself and therefore you and all other libertarians. So what's your number out of 10?
Well, can I just say how I'd react to the supermarket first? I think I would do the very British thing and tut very loudly. And probably
that's a good social enforcement mechanism.
Yeah, and probably if there's someone else who also saw this infringement, if you like, we'd probably look at each other and feel morally superior to that person
and nod knowingly at each other.
Nod knowingly. What a shame. And we'd hope in vain that would make the person change their behaviour next time they're in the supermarket. On numbers, I genuinely don't know because we don't know yet whether there's going to be a second wave or subsequent waves. We don't know how long this is going to last. We don't know how long it's going to take.
There's no scientific certainty here, Syed, but you've got to give me a number.
5
for
scientific uncertainty.
I'm a 5 as well. My panel didn't cheer me up that much this week, but Syed, Sam, Tom, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure to be in your company. My thanks to all of our previous guests as well. The total number comes out at 5.3 this week. So everybody was somewhere in the middle, no number higher than a 7, no number lower than a 3. So for all of the extreme libertarianism you sometimes hear on this channel, we've ended up in a very balanced median position. Thanks to all of you for joining us as my guests today. It's been a great pleasure discussing all of these issues with you. I say my thanks as well to Toby, Douglas, Julian, Maddie, Victoria, and Dia at the earlier on in the show. I hope you've enjoyed watching us on YouTube. The next Live with Littlewood is next Wednesday, 22nd of July, 6 p.m. UK time. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, IEA London. So if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe. Please hit the notification bell. If you've enjoyed this broadcast, please hit the thumbs up. You can also follow our podcast at ieapodcast.podbean.com. Visit our website, iea.org.uk, where you can sign up for our newsletter, IEA Daily, and to the IEA book club. Special thanks to our donors. If you've got any money spare in these difficult times, please do donate to us. Enjoy the rest of your evening. Stay free, stay safe. I'm off to do some shopping. Over and out.